All right, I'm going to introduce you to the blood system. One of the key things that you need to understand is why do we have a circulatory system? Why does blood course through our veins? Well, that's because we have to trade things with the environment. And because we're multicellular and we're really big, our outside surface area to volume ratio isn't great. So we've got to be able to move things, to be able to exchange things with our environment using our blood and then, out through the lungs and so on. So, it's really important that we can trade with the environment. And we know unicellular organisms, they can just use simple diffusion and active transport, whereas we need something more complex than that. And what we're trading with the environment is our cells and tissues. We need O2 for cell respiration because, that's one of the important components. And we also need glucose for cell respiration as well. And then, of course, other important substances like ions, hormones, nutrients, you name it. And what we have to get rid of then are metabolic wastes, such as CO2, and then nitrogenous wastes. So we've got to have the blood system moving around. We've already studied that digestion, and we know that we absorb a lot of the glucose and a lot of the nutrients from our small intestine, and then that's moving around and can be transported to our cells. And of course, you probably understand that oxygen is how we get in, or through our lungs. We get oxygen through our lungs, which then there's capillaries and other things there. We're going to do that system next. And so once that gets into our lungs, it has to be transported as well. So our cells need to get the glucose that's, been digested and absorbed from our digestive system. And then we also need to get oxygen that we breathe in through our lungs to each of the cells. And that's going to happen through our blood. Then when we do metabolism, we're going to have waste products. We've got to breathe out CO2. So we've got to get all that from our cells to our lungs. And of course, nitrogenous waste we need to get rid of. And that's going to end up probably traveling through the kidney, and we'll get rid of it that way. Okay. So mammals have this double circulatory system. It's really cool. There's a system, one loop is going to go to the body, from the heart and sending everything to the body, but then the other one goes to the lungs because it picks up oxygen. And so we are going to take a look at that. You need to be able to trace blood throughout the body. So here is a crazy looking diagram. Of course, it has the heart at the center because that's the motor, that's the pump for it all. And then we've got, the upper half of the body and the lower half of the body. And then here's our pulmonary circuit here, right? That's the loop that's going to go to the lungs from the heart. And then we also have our systemic circuit, which is to our body. So that's got to go up and down. And we're going to be tracing blood as it goes from the heart. And we're going to be talking about how it needs to pick up oxygen in our pulmonary circuit and then comes back to the heart again to get pumped back out to the rest of the body. And then, of course, your body has to return it back to the heart again. So it's got this double flow, and you can see we've got these kind of numbers associated with it. All right, so first of all, the heart is the motor, right? It's what's pumping it. And the heart valves, there's these little valves in the heart that'll open and close, and that dictates that blood only flows in one direction through your circulatory system. And blood begins its flow with the right ventricle pumping blood to the lungs. So you can see right here, and we're going to look at the heart in lots of detail. You're going to need to be able to label it, but the ventricles are the big chambers down below. And we're going to start our pathway looking with that ventricle first, and then how that gets pumped through to the pulmonary circuit. And in the lungs, once that gets pumped into the lungs, it's going to go into the lungs. It's going to pick up oxygen and unload CO2. And so then you'll see it looks really bright red. It's not technically blue when it doesn't have oxygen, but it's a darker shade. It gets really bright once it picks up all that oxygen. And then after it unloads the CO2 and picks up oxygen, it's going to return back to the heart. And when it returns back to the heart, then that oxygen-rich blood can now be pumped out to the rest of the body, okay? And you can see from here, this is the left ventricle, which is the most powerful muscle in the heart. It's going to pump through the aorta. It's an artery leaving the heart, and that aorta goes both up to your body and then down to your head and then down to your lower extremities, where it's going to then bring that oxygen and glucose and other things to cells. And then it's going to pick up the waste products like CO2, and then it will return to the heart. So blood returns to the heart into what's called the right atrium. Okay. Some terms, we know that arteries are things that leave the heart and veins are things that return to the heart. So that's it. It has to do with the directionality thing. So arteries are any vessels that are leaving the heart. So you can see if the arrows are moving away from the heart, that's going to be an artery. And so here's an artery that's going to the lungs. We call that the pulmonary artery. And here's a big artery leaving the heart, and that aorta is a big artery as well. And then the things that return. So we have this pulmonary vein right here, and that's bringing blood back to the heart. And there is also a pulmonary artery that brings blood back to the heart. All right. So let's look at the whole flow. And you would need to be able to describe the pathway of blood through. And we're going to start with the first one. So we have this right ventricle in the heart. Now, you're probably looking at the screen going, wait, right ventricle, that's the left side of the screen. We describe the left and right based on the person itself. So it's actually, if this person was facing us, that would be their right side. Okay, so this is the right ventricle. And the ventricles are the big chambers in the heart. You know, there's 4 chambers to the heart. There's the atrium, 2 atria, and 2 ventricles. And the atria are small. They're going to receive blood from the body and from the lungs. And then it'll send it to the ventricles. And the ventricles are the more powerful, bigger chambers. And that is what will then send it away from the heart, is from that. This is where most of the muscle is. You can see all that muscle and how thick it is here. Okay, so if we start with the right ventricle, the blood in the right ventricle it's come back from the body, right? So it's full of CO2. The O2 is low because it's dropped off all the O2 back at the rest of the body. So where that needs to go now is to the lungs to pick up more O2, okay, and get rid of the CO2. So what it's going to do is when that pumps, it's going to send it through the pulmonary arteries, right? And the pulmonary, so this is the pulmonary circuit, sends it through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. And it picks up oxygen in the lungs, gets rid of carbon dioxide, and then it's going to travel back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. And then it's going to go into the right atrium. Okay, so you can see both of the pulmonary veins are coming back to the right atrium. The left atrium. So it's coming back, the pulmonary veins drop into the left atrium. And now the blood has lots and lots of oxygen. The goal is to get it out to the body so it can be used. So it's going to go from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And as I mentioned before on the last slide, the left ventricle is the most powerful muscle because it's got to be able to pump all of this blood all the way up to your head and all the way down to your feet. The right ventricle is powerful, but it doesn't have to go as far. It only has to get to your lungs, whereas we've got to get the blood here to travel all the way through your body. So there needs to be lots of pressure here. So the left ventricle will then send all of this oxygenated blood through the aorta, which will then go up and down, right? And then goes through to the capillaries and does all the gas exchange. So it's going to drop off the oxygen to your body cells and pick up the waste products like carbon dioxide, okay? And then it will return through the vena cava. There's both an anterior and posterior vena cava. And it'll bring that. Now it's going to be low in oxygen, higher in CO2, and it brings that back to the right atrium. Okay, so you need to be able to follow that all the way through. There's another animation from the Amoeba Sisters that I think you might enjoy looking at because it kind of shows where things are going a little bit better. And here is the heart. You need to be able to draw and label the heart, but you don't need a fancy drawing like this. It could literally be a box where the top of the box, there's 4 chambers in it, right? And these are smaller boxes than the bottom boxes here, but you have to show how thick the walls are in the ventricle, and then these need to be bigger. And you should be able to trace the blood flow, and there's also these valves that you need to be able to label as well. All right, so starting with the right ventricle again, we're going to go from the right ventricle through the semilunar valve, okay? And these valves keep the blood from flowing backwards. So when the pressure is high here, it'll open, but once this relaxes and the pressure is lower here, that valve will close. So it keeps it going in one direction. Okay, so the right ventricle through the semilunar valve, out the pulmonary arteries. And then it's going to come back through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, right? And then it's going to pass through the AV valves, the atrioventricular valves. This one is the bicuspid. You've probably heard of bicuspid and tricuspid. And it's going to pass through to these valves into the ventricle. And again, when the pressure is high here, it'll be open. But once this relaxes and this starts to fill, this will snap shut to keep the blood flow going in the right direction. And then it goes to the left ventricle. And then from the left ventricle, the heart's going to beat and then pump it out through this another semilunar valve, right? And then into the aorta, which goes to the body in all directions. And then it'll return through the vena cava into the right atrium. Okay, you need to be able to draw a box diagram, but make sure that you also show how thick the walls are around, especially the left ventricle comparatively, and that the atrium are smaller than the ventricles. And make sure you get the right and left right, because it's kind of weird being in a different direction.